Lecture on sexual motivation. Why is sexual motivation something that we need to talk about in psychology? Well, when it comes right down to it, you can look at human beings as a biological organism, and the act of sex-free, blah, blah, blah. But we're going to see if this works. And if it does, I'm going to be thrilled. So we're going to start talking about the history of sex in psychology. We have to start with Alfred Kinsey. Kinsey was a researcher back in the 1940s. He was actually an entomologist, meaning that he studied moth behavior, he studied insects. What he ends up doing is having grad school students in the 1940s. They were mostly male, usually between 22 and 24, and often newly married. They would come and they would talk to him about any of the relationship problems they were having with their wives. And often these problems had a lot to do with their sexual experiences with their wives after marriage. If they were not harmonious or expected, there was usually a conflict within the relationship, a question about whether or not love was really present, or if they were really meant to be together. And interestingly enough, people still have those conversations if they don't seem to sync up physically. Now, that's not necessarily the truth, but Kinsey sits there and he says, all right, here's something that we need to look at. These varied sexual behaviors and attitudes within people. And so the first group he looks at is 18,000 white males. And so he looks at males first. Now, in his research, he creates what's called a 7-point scale sexual continuum. And it is wildly popularly accepted. His book becomes a New York Times bestseller. The university is very proud of his research. And then later he does the same research with women. And he is essentially torn down as a researcher, largely because no one wants to talk about female sexuality in a society. Today, when we look at Kinsey and we look at his research, there is a question about whether or not it is reliable research, whether or not we could replicate his studies. Later in the 1960s, we look at Masters and Johnson, and they do research that is acceptable, or far more acceptable as far as being reliable and valid research. Masters and Johnson in 1966 create what we call the physical response cycle for sex. So you need to know the 4 stages: excitement, plateau, orgasm, and resolution. Make sure that you understand the stage that they go in. And on the next slide, we will look at how they vary between men and women. So make sure you are comfortable with the term refractory period. We had refractory stage during neural firing. This is going to be a point at which the organism or the neuron has to wait before it can fire again because it needs to reset. Also understand that there are sexual problems that can be encountered by men and women. Men, most commonly premature ejaculation and erectile disorders. Women might actually have something called an orgasmic disorder. And in either case, they are going to impact people when it comes to relationships, the way that they see themselves or feel about themselves. The problems become far more reaching than just their ability to engage in this one physical behavior. It becomes an emotional component also. And again, you can look at things like this in society. We're far more accepting of talking about male sexual disorders on television. You'll see things like advertisements for Viagra or Cialis. We don't see the same thing for women. And there are behavioral therapies that we can utilize, systematic desensitization, flooding. But again, when we talk about a behavior therapy, we're going back to classical and operant conditioning. Here's that sexual response cycle that I told you that you need to know. There is a difference between men and women, males and females. Males essentially kind of almost work like clockwork. There's excitement, then they plateau, then there's orgasm, and then there's a steep resolution. In other words, once the behaviors happen, they have a sense of relief. Very quickly, they tailor back off, they come back down. It's like getting off a roller coaster, I guess. You know, that everything has kind of happened and now it's coming down. For females, there's 3 different possibilities. There's one that mimics exactly what men have. There's the possibility that they have excitement and then they plateau, and then there is absolutely no orgasm, which means resolution is very slow. So essentially it's like looking at a crazy roller coaster and then finding out that you don't even go through one loop to loop. The heart rate, nothing else, it just kind of stays basic. And then you could have multiple orgasms. Now, when we're talking about the physical responses, there are 3 possibilities for women, and it has nothing to do with necessarily the person. Any one of these 3 could occur. So where men become more like clockwork, women aren't necessarily. And so to tie in things like love or emotional stability with a response to a physical act doesn't always work with women. It's much more complex than just one behavior leads to one outcome. You guys should be familiar with the hormones that we would talk about. Estrogen is secreted by both males and females. In non-human mammals, you're going to have greater levels of estrogen prior to and during ovulation. However, with females that are of the human species, you actually have an increase in testosterone. So women become more aggressive the closer they get to ovulating. Testosterone is going to be the most important of the male sex hormones or androgens, but remember, again, women produce it. That's the only way that we can have the male expressive organs. During fetal development, men will be bathed in testosterone, and that's how they become externally expressive. However, hormones may affect sexual desire, but they do not affect the ability to have sex. When we talk about sexual behavior, first we'll look at it from an evolutionary standpoint, and this is something that we'll call parental investment. When we look at men versus women, do they differ in the time that they have to invest having a child, the energy that they have to invest? Is there a survival risk to them becoming pregnant? And will they possibly miss certain opportunities? The reality is that if you really look at this, men make smaller investments. Take away society, strip away morals. Can a man walk away from a pregnancy? The answer is yes. Can a woman walk away from a pregnancy? And the answer very simply is absolutely not. So, women make larger investments. Because they have to invest more, they become far more selective in their mate selection. So, just a quick, lovely flow chart. Biological reality. Reproduction involves minimal investment, time, energy, and risk for men. The evolutionary significance. They will seek out more partners. The more partners, the greater reproduction. The greater reproduction, the more of their genes exist in a society. The behavioral outcome, more interested in uncommitted sex and youth and attractive partners that can bear children. Now, remember, when we're talking about these things, we have stripped away morality, we have stripped away societal expectations, religion, family, all these other things. We're talking about it just as a biological behavior. Throw all of those other factors in, and it becomes different. So we're not necessarily talking about men who are just cads going after young women, but we are looking at kind of why there is a difference in the approach to sex between between the genders or sexes. Females, huge amount of risk and energy and time. Yes, even in 2016, 17, 18, you can still die in pregnancy. You can still have complications. Energy. Yeah, if you're being chased by a lion, you're going to want to make sure someone's chucking a spear at that lion, because in hunter-gatherer times, you aren't going to have the energy. You're putting that energy into having a child. Today, we're not worried about lions coming after us, but your job, the amount of sleep that you get, you're still expending more energy. You're talking about time. Once children enter the picture, you can't just get rid of them. And so there's a huge component of time. So the significance of this, women are going to be far more selective. They are going to want to have a partner that invests their time in helping raise their child. So fewer partners over time, and they're going to look for things like income, status, ambition. In other words, a provider. So this isn't that women are gold diggers. In fact, if you are thinking about having a child, chances are you are going to look for somebody who can help raise the child, not somebody who's just really good looking and then is going to leave you to deal with all of that responsibility. So there are differences in this. The big question then becomes, who decides when sex happens? And the answer is obviously women. Now we're taking out the component of things like coercion and force. If it's just by choice, women are the deciding factor because they have to worry more about investment and risk. So biologically, you have to wait for sexual maturity, which we would call puberty. There has to be hormones present, and later we'll talk about sexual orientation. Just a quick note. When you hear the slides on sexual orientation, these are not my personal opinions. This is the research that is currently out there. Psychological. We'll look at exposure to fantasy, to internal and external stimuli, and then ultimately we'll also look at social and cultural impact. Family, society, religion, your personal values, and then expectations of the culture around you. So first thing we'll talk about is external stimuli. And this can be any material that heightens sexual arousal. Now, men and women can both have a response to erotic material. Women more so under controlled conditions. When we look at our explicit materials, they can have a negative or an adverse effect. So when we're looking at things like pornography, there's increased viewer acceptance of sexual coercion. Now, we're not talking necessarily rape, but we're talking more about no doesn't necessarily mean no. So there's no causal expression here, but what we do have is that people believe that women become more objectified, that their opinions become less sincere, and that if you just ask enough, or you just convince enough, or if you push hard enough, if you continue to make them question whether or not they truly know how they feel about themselves, that you could get them to engage in a behavior that they otherwise wouldn't want to do. And that is something that has grown in research recently, because there is the prevalence of the internet and access to pornography that was not available even in decades past. And so when we look at it, this is something where we start to see women being devalued. There really is no male correlation in pornography where men are devalued or treated as essentially just interchangeable objects. But that doesn't mean that women escape devaluing their partners. So I put up kind of two great love stories, Ross and Rachel, and then here we are looking at The Princess Bride. When we're looking at these two stories, you have the young farm boy who goes away to make his fortune, who comes back and dies and comes essentially back to life to fight for the woman that he loves. And you have Friends, where you have these two people who have these grand expressions of love throughout their love story, and they do things that are kind of over the top for each other. If you wait for someone to have the financial resources of a Hollywood budget, and if you wait for somebody to make things absolutely perfect, continue waiting. There really is no perfect first kiss. I mean, they're always awkward and weird. And nobody has an entire Friday off and thousands of dollars to fill your apartment with roses and tea candles just to ask you on a date. The reality is that if you're looking for people to be more than people, you're going to diminish how happy you are with your partner. I always kind of like to look at the things that make me happiest with my husband, and it is just a note every morning that he leaves me that says the dog is taken care of, that he loves me, and he hopes that I have a good day. And he waits for every morning me to either leave him a note or to text him saying that I hope you're safe today and that I love you. That's something small, and it's something that we can maintain and something we can do. In fact, we've done it for 12 years now. But if I'm waiting for him to come home with a bouquet of roses every single day, or to meet me with breakfast in bed because it's Wednesday, I better be willing to do the same thing for him. This fictional romance, these dime store novels that you see where these people are doing these grand gestures, if you want it done for you, you have to be willing to do it for the other person. And we start to devalue our partners if they don't live up to these fantastical, fictional types of romances. And that doesn't mean that occasionally on an anniversary or even a holiday that I refuse to celebrate, Valentine's Day, that you can't do those things. But just remember, if you are trying to have somebody be your Prince Charming, they may not be able to live up to that expectation. They just might not. It might be too perfect or too impossible for it to really be reality. Imagine stimuli. So some of it is going to be things that you can see, and then some of them are going to be the little movie reels that run in your head. And we know that people, even with spinal cord injuries, so they have no physical sensation, still feel sexual desire. Now, that doesn't mean that they can engage in the act, but they still have the emotional desire, which tells you one major thing. Sexual desire comes from in very large parts your brain. So you have your physiological readiness, meaning that you have had to have gone through puberty. So my very young children do not have this. You could have imagined stimuli, so just a recording in your head of something that's happened to you in the past, or something that you have thought of, a daydream, or actual external stimuli. Something physically that is present for you to desire. And all of those can have an impact on your sexual motivation. Imagine stimuli. Well, dreams happen, and so we know during REM sleep that you have genital arousal, and that can accompany all types of dreams, including the romantic and the sexual ones. When you're awake, you can dwell on memories or fantasies, and there's a big difference between fantasy and reality for women. Women might sit there and fantasize about a man who's so alluring that when she says no, she really means yes, and he's waiting, or she's waiting for him to pick up on the signals. The reality is that fantasy is controllable. It's in the mind of the person who is creating the storyline, and so they can make sure everything is safe and controlled. In reality, when a woman says no, she's not waiting for the man to take no and turn it into a yes. There's a very big difference between fantasizing and then encounters with hostile strangers. When we look at fantasizing in general, men in general, regardless of sexual orientation, fantasize about sex more often and more about the physical act. Big difference again. Women fantasize more about the storyline, about the romantic components, about how the people met and what they mean to each other, about the emotionality of the relationship far more than they do about the physicality, which just goes into how much I hate Sex and the City and the big fat lie it has about how women can treat something like sex the same as men. And this isn't opinion-based, this is research-based. When we look at it from an evolutionary standpoint, if we look at it from an emotional standpoint, if we look at it from a psychological standpoint, there are differences. Women and men do approach this one idea, this act, all of it differently. Social and cultural factors. You don't get to escape society. You may believe something, but if society believes differently, you are still going to be grossly impacted by it. So, take Sex and the City. They put out this idea that women can have casual interactions with sex and have no impact. But the reality is that in Hollywood, you can make up a story and everyone in that society can support that story, at least the society that is being presented on television. But try to present that message in Fauquier County, and I guarantee you that you will get labeled, you will be treated differently. It doesn't continue to work. So cultural views differ on acceptable sexual behaviors, even when we're talking about what Hollywood might put out as opposed to, just regular America. Our views change over time, and they also change within culture. So we're different than 1940s America. And then your religion, your society, your cultural views, they have an impact on what we're willing to research, how we treat things like the topics that we're willing to discuss, and the laws that surround them. Do you think it is or is not morally wrong for a couple to have a baby if they're not married? Well, we would sit there and say here in the United States, we're very understanding, but the reality is that for us, it's about a 50-50 flip. We're closer in our responses to India than we are to Mexico. Now remember, you have to bring in a whole lot of other components. It's not just who is a developed nation or has lots of industry. It has a lot to do with economics, it has to do with religion, it has to do with societal values, it has to do with whether you're collectivist or individualistic. And so when we're looking at it, strangely enough, American ideas are much closer tied into collectivist nations than they are other individualistic nations. And so we often think about something like children out of wedlock as a fault in the family, in the group. And then we also do apply it to the individual. Now again, that's not 100% of the time. That's somewhere around about 48% of the time. And that's not every single person. Again, we're looking at the country as a total. In adolescence, this is when sexual attraction, sexual identity develops. So, once puberty happens, you get to understand your orientation. I mean, it actually solidifies itself. Now, you may have had some idea prior to it that you found people of the same or the opposite gender or same or opposite sex attractive. But the reality is it's at puberty that it becomes very clear that you actually have desire. Please keep that in mind. And then when we look at things like promiscuity, modern Western culture has greater promiscuity than Arab and Asian countries. You can thank, I guess, the automobile in some cases for this. Americans have no problem with their, well, not necessarily no problem, but we've accepted that we will put our teenagers in cars and then trust them to drive to a movie and go on a date unchaperoned. And not universally, but for the most part, that's very much an American thing. Arab and Asian cultures, you do not just take someone's daughter out for a date. Well, I mean, not without maybe a brother or a father or a male chaperone following along. And so there are differences in how we treat adolescent sexuality, dating, all of these other things that will tie into sexuality. So looking at this, look at this graph here off to your right. Percent of babies born to unmarried women, a third were teens, has more than quadrupled. We have a decreasing birth rate among married women and a doubling birth rate among unmarried women. So why do we have a decreasing birth rate among married women? Well, it's because we have had a change in cultural standards. Usually women who get married and then have children often are following a different plan. They're going to school, they're getting higher education, they're getting a career, they get married, and then they have kids, and they have fewer kids because of the financial costs involved. Not absolute, but just a bit more common. Unmarried women, they may have gotten pregnant earlier. It also extends the number of years that they can have more children. So if you're having children very early on in your early 20s and you get married, say, at 30, you still have a really good chunk of time to have more kids. And so there's more that kind of plays into this. But as you're looking at the graph, how many of you guys noticed Japan? Percentage of births to unwed mothers is almost zero in Japan. But when we're looking at the United States, Canada, and Britain, all individualistic societies, we have an incredible increase. Japan, a collectivist society, is almost flatlined. This is all coming from a Canadian research into the impact of contraception. Now, I'm not going to talk to you guys about contraception. We're just going to look at the exposure to having knowledge and what it does, and what they're looking at for teen activity. So, ignorance of contraception. When they don't have the right idea about birth control methods, they often omit using them. If there's guilt related to sexual activity, they're less likely to use contraceptives or get information about them. Minimal communication. Teenagers feel uncomfortable about discussing contraceptives. Guess what? So do parents and adults. This is probably the one unit that I hate talking about the most because it is really something that can have a whole lot of different impacts religiously, socially, etc., etc. And so no real interest in talking to you guys about this topic. Now, if it's my own kids, I don't really ever want to talk to them about this, but I'm going to have to. And so people do have minimal communication. It's not just the teens, it's also the adults and the parents. We'll do it, it's not comfortable. Alcohol use. If you get drunk, you tend to be more dumb than if you're not drunk. That's just an easy one. So if you're using a lot of alcohol prior to engaging in this behavior, one, you may engage in the behavior when you didn't really want to, and two, you're less likely to reach for a contraceptive. And then the mass media. The more often in television, movies, pornography, you don't see safe sex, then you see people who believe that there is a chance that unprotected sex can be safe. And so that can be very dangerous. So, how do we reduce sexual activity in teens? Well, the more intelligent a teen is, the less likely they are to have sex. But think about it. If you're highly intelligent, one, you probably have a really strong understanding about the possible risks that come with this behavior. But on top of that, you've probably planned out your life. You've probably thought about how it would impact whether or not you go to college, how it would impact whether or not you got a job or went to grad school, or how you would pay for things. You start to factor in all of these other things, and you might delay it because of the risk involved. Religious faith. In teens and adults, they're more often to reserve sex for marital commitment. And this is, notice it doesn't say a specific religion, but if we're looking at any of the real major religions, there's often in there a statement about waiting until marriage. And if you believe there's a higher power, or you believe in something greater than yourself, then there's a greater chance that you will delay or that you will wait. Having a father present. Now, this seems kind of a strange thing, and it's not because the father scares away boys, but it has been researched and it's been shown that having a father present, especially a father who is a caring, nurturing father, women, and young women specifically, don't seek out protection, connection, or love from other males. They actually wait until they have found somebody who is the right person. The absence of a father can actually contribute to higher teen sexual activity. And then learning programs. If you had to teach other people about all the risks that come with sexual activity, all of the diseases and everything that could possibly go wrong, chances are you're going to be less likely to engage in the behavior as well. So here we are on sexual orientation. With orientation, we are not talking about sexual behavior. So orientation has to do with preferences for emotional and sexual relationships of either the same sex, both sexes, or the opposite sex. Please keep in mind that you can lie about your sexual orientation. So sexual behavior and orientation are not synonymous. When we look at the number or the percentage of people who claim to be homosexual in our society, there's large variations in the numbers, and here's why. It depends on how you're defining it. So you could have 1 in 10 or 3 to 4% of males and approximately 1% of females. Now, for most of the research that I've seen, it usually for males being homosexual or gay, it's somewhere anywhere from about 2 to 4% of the overall population. And for women, it's usually only about 1 to 2%. When we're looking at this, it's hard because it depends on whether or not you're talking about a single act, someone who believes that they're entirely or exclusively homosexual, or someone who might have bisexual tendencies. So again, it really depends on how they phrase the question. We will look at the continuum of behavior, but one really big thing. This is a societal change, and I just feel that it's necessary to make sure that everyone's clear on this. Homosexuality is not a psychological disorder. It was once in the DSM-3. Back in the 1970s, it was removed. We no longer consider homosexuality to be criminal. So, in the United States and in other countries, up until about the 1970s, many of them would incarcerate people for homosexual behavior, which led to intolerance. It led to people hiding their orientation, and we're still living in the aftermath of that. If you want to watch a really good movie that kind of looks at this intolerance, watch The Imitation Game. Now, it's not specifically about Alan Turing being a homosexual. It has more to do with him being the reason that World War II ended 2 to 4 years earlier than it might have, that he saved 14 million lives, that he was a brilliant mathematician who did amazing things, but when it was found out that he was a homosexual in the 1950s, the government gave him the option between imprisonment or chemical castration for what they called indecency. And he chose chemical castration. This is at the very end of the movie. You don't get a whole lot into it, but you look at all of the amazing things that he did to protect the world. And then this ended up being treatment for his orientation. There's been a change, there's been a shift in our kind of understanding about homosexuality in the last 70 years. Another big point. Pedophilia and homosexuality are not synonymous. In sociology, when we used to talk about sex in society, we would watch some of the really old newsreels and opinion polls from the 1950s and 1960s. And essentially, people believe that homosexuality was pedophilia, and it's not. It is in no way pedophilia. People who are normal, and I will say this, people who are normal desire to have relationships with people that are roughly about the same age. So, I have arrested several pedophiles. Of the people that I arrested, the majority, and I'm talking about the extreme majority, were heterosexual. Adult men who actually wanted or had engaged in relationships with young girls. So, pedophiles can be heterosexual or homosexual. Either way, socially, morally, legally, it is wrong. Homosexuality is not pedophilia. Just please keep that distinction correct. Most people who are homosexuals, most people who are heterosexuals, engage in sexual relationships with people that are of the appropriate age. Here's Kinsey's 7-point scale, and remember this is from about the 1940s. On the continuum ends, you have exclusively heterosexual and then exclusively homosexual. And then he would say everywhere in between there is this kind of sliding scale. You'd have incidental homosexual behavior, so that might be fantasies. More than incidental homosexual behavior, maybe having engaged in a behavior. When you get to roughly 3 or 4, you're talking about people who would almost kind of consider themselves bisexual, and then closer and closer to exclusively homosexual. His 7-point scale is later adapted into a 14-point scale. Robert Epstein in 2007 did another survey. He did 18,000 people again, and he took Kinsey's 7-point scale and he put it into a 14-point scale. And again, it's self-report, so people can lie, but ideally with a population that large, the sample should factor out any of kind of the anomalies or the wrong the people who give response sets. And so what you see is that the majority of people report being straight or more straight. You have people that come down a much smaller percentage that tend to be more gay. And then some people who factor somewhere in all of that when it comes to bisexual behaviors. And again, it makes both evolutionary sense and biological sense that since the way that we continue a population is through heterosexual behavior, that the mass majority of people are going to find themselves at that end of the continuum. Don't look for this to all of a sudden factor out to like equal across the board. You still have to take into account biology. So, origins of sexual orientation. This, again, not my opinion. This is coming from research. Homosexuality is, according to the APA, more likely based on biological factors, differing brain centers, genetics, and during fetal development, hormone exposure, rather than environmental factors. Now, I'm going to say this, and for those of you who have a strong religious belief, I'm not here to challenge that. I ask that you guys maintain whatever beliefs that you have. What I'm going to do during this portion is I'm going to expose you guys to what the current research is. That is it. So if we're looking at personal histories, what we have seen is that extremely feminine behavior in young men or incredibly masculine behavior in young females has started to show somewhat of a predictive nature in later development of homosexuality. So 75 to 90% of highly feminine young boys turn out to be gay. Now, a lot of girls at this point in class will say things like, well, I was a tomboy. And to be honest, I was a massive tomboy. I didn't wear skirts and dresses until I think after college. That's not the same. We're talking a higher level of identification. Because of negative parental and social attitudes about homosexuality, many initially deny it. So we have this term coming out of the closet, and really the reason this may occur is because of bullying and a hostile society. You have to understand that even though you personally might be accepting, that society isn't always gracious and warm about people who are homosexual. And so you may have people understanding that they're going against sometimes the norms of society, being very guarded and very careful about when they choose to express or if they choose to express. You also have to look at the way that families believe and the way the people around others are willing to treat somebody. And so they may choose not to share this part of themselves with everyone. Looking at the brain. This is something that you cannot choose. Remember this. If I asked you right now to make a part of your brain smaller, try as you might, you don't have the ability to do that. So in homosexual men, the size of the anterior hypothalamus, remember hypothalamus is going to be the structure of the brain that deals with things like thirst, hunger, sexual motivation, is smaller, and the anterior commissure is larger. What this means is that this area of the brain in homosexual males is far more representative of a female brain than it is of a male brain. When we look at a number of reasons that genetics may play into things like homosexuality, family studies show that it often seems to run in families. Twin studies, homosexuality is far more common in identical twins than fraternal. Now we're not talking about 100%, but we are talking about if you have one twin that has an identical twin that is homosexual, there is a 50% chance, 52% exactly, that the other twin might be homosexual as well. Fraternal twins having the same first environment and also being siblings, there's 22%, which is significant. And then in adoption, we have about 11%. Identical twins show greater genetic overlap. Newer studies that were conducted with a larger, more representative sample have provided more support for the conclusion that heredity influences sexual orientation. And then the last one is that genetic engineers could manipulate female fruit flies to act like males during courtship and males to act like females. So we have this idea that you can do genetic manipulation in smaller organisms, then that might point to the greater the complexity of the organism, genetic manipulation might still happen. Now, again, we're talking fruit flies, but we are still seeing the ability to genetically manipulate orientation. Prenatal hormone. So, also looking at this, again, they did the research with animals because you can't do this to humans, but exposure of a fetus to testosterone in female sheep, they started to exhibit homosexual behavior. So a female sheep who had more testosterone would more likely engage in attraction to other female sheep. When we're looking at exposures of male and female fetuses, what they think is that in humans, the greater number of brothers, the lower production possibly of testosterone, and so not enough testosterone may cause male fetuses to have attraction more similar to a female. When we look at homosexuality, it is not exclusive to humans. We see it in the animal world. If you want to read up on this, there is a reading in the reading sections called Bisexual Species. It is just not unique to humans alone. We see it in the animal world for varying reasons. Take a chance to look through this one. We talked about the brain differences, and again, we see that there is a larger similarity between women and gay men in the formation of the brain. Genetic influences, you're going back to the fruit fly manipulation, and then also the facts between identical twins. Prenatal hormone, again, men with several older brothers more likely to be gay because they may have had less exposure to testosterone. Again, you can meet somebody who has tons of older brothers and that's not true, so just remember that this is not absolute. And then there's these other differences that are listed below. I honestly cannot tell you why they happen. I don't know why, but we have seen these as being significant changes that kind of consistently happen between straight and gay men. So when we're looking at changes in opinions, extramarital sex is always wrong. That's cheating on your partner. People have started to believe that that is wrong far more often, and homosexuality as always wrong has decreased. So again, this idea that changes in attitudes over time, society does start to change its attitudes. The last thing that we really will talk about, promiscuity. So having taken into this the totality of everything else that we've talked about, you cannot talk about sexual research without looking at values. And we know the differences between the way men are treated with sexuality and the way that women are treated with sexuality. There are psychological risks, being labeled. There are social risks, whether or not someone is willing to continue to have a relationship with you based off of your sexual history. There are health risks. We have venereal diseases. We have blood-borne diseases. We have diseases that can get easily transmitted. You have pregnancy. Now, I'm not saying that that is a bad thing, but that can still cause health risks. And then there's moral problems, the way that you feel about yourself and the way that other people are willing to treat you. Highly promiscuous people have to be willing to face that realistically, not everyone is going to agree with their behavior. That does not evaporate just because you're okay with it. Society doesn't necessarily always have to agree with you. Neither does your family, and neither does everyone else around you. So, high promiscuity comes with consequences. And lastly, when we talk about things like sexual behavior, you are a social animal. Humans are social. We are meant to belong with others. Now, that's not synonymous with we are meant to have promiscuous sex, but we need to belong. One of the things that we find most important is our attachment to others, to wanting to be part of a friendship or a family or a group. Separation is damaging to us. So when we look at this, we also need to be aware that we just have this basic need to belong. That should be it for this. Please make sure that you guys take a chance to kind of look at the biology. Please read over your textbook. If you have any questions, email me, and I have a feeling I will be seeing you guys next week.